Welcome to Business at the Speed of Coffee, a television program by business people, for business, about business. I've been concerned for some time about the prospects for people saving for their retirement and the investment climate in general. The other day I was having a cup of coffee with an old friend, Sam Stubbs. To those of you in the financial community, he probably doesn't take that much introduction, but he has stood astride the financial investment community for several decades, and most recently set up an investment fund called Simplicity. Now we'll be talking about the financial markets and Simplicity as we go through this program, but at the beginning I'd like to hear the story from the beginning. So Sam Stubbs, welcome to Business at the Speed of Coffee.
G'day.
So where did it all start for you?
Gosh, look, I'm a West Auckland boy, so from Sunnyvale, and I grew up, I guess I made one amazing decision in my life. I chose my parents well. So they were both school teachers, and so they gave me some pretty good grounded values and work ethic. And I started out in actually teaching at university, and then I went into the computer business. I worked for a company called IBM back then, which were amazing. Yeah. And then look, for probably all the wrong reasons, I went into the finance industry. It was principally because they seemed to be going out with prettier women and driving faster cars, and I was a young, impressionable guy. And so I went into investment banking then, and pretty much stayed in that and asset management and all aspects of finance for the last 3 decades.
Were you really smart at school?
No, not particularly. No, I would call myself, above average, but nothing to shout home about. And I failed law school. I went in there, and I once again, love tripped me up there. A particular girlfriend of the year there, and I went then into what I really loved doing, which was politics and philosophy. And I graduated from university there, and went off into the banking world. I didn't have a single financial qualification.
So that wasn't
wholly
a
unqualified.
sort of forensic financial beginning.
No, not at all. Well, I guess it was an entrepreneurial beginning, because I used to look. I grew up before Trade Me, when it was trade and exchange, and I had an amazing life in West Auckland, because we need to get money, right, and didn't have money. So I used to go out to the factories in Henderson and go into their jumbo bins on a Saturday morning and see what I could take out of the jumbo bins and recycle. So there used to be a sellotape factory in Henderson, so I used to get the half-worn rolls of sellotape, and I traded those at school for various things. I used to, the picture framers. There was a marble store. The most amazing one was, back in those days, the post office used to put all their telephones in, and you only allowed one telephone per household. So a friend of mine, Eddie, he and I, aged about 12, we used to go to the place where the post office repaired the telephones. These guys took a shining to us, and they just gave us all these old ones that weren't working. We used to disassemble them, reassemble them into working telephones, and we ran this sort of illegal extension service in West Auckland. We would install an extension in your house illegally, and it was $20 if we didn't like you and $10 if we did. And so my house had, about 9 phones at one stage, when the law said you could only have one. So we made some money that way, and then I went and delivered papers and, packed supermarket bags, all that. So there was a basic work ethic out in those days. Yeah. And I think that was the case for a lot of people. I mean, there wasn't a shortage of jobs. There wasn't a shortage of part-time jobs, and I was underage labour back in those days. I remember working for 99 cents an hour, stripping wires, but there was something really cool about that, because it taught you a work ethic,
So when did what was your first real job?
My first real job was at IBM, and I was hired as a salesperson. Back in those days, IBM were making so much money that they would train you for a year. I went over to Australia, and they trained me as a salesperson. I came in and looked after the Air New Zealand account, which was interesting in those days, because IBM had the monopoly on mainframe supply of computers, and I think Air New Zealand had just bought their first competitor product and put it on the floor, and IBM, out of a fit of pique, just withdrew all of their support for Air New Zealand. They just literally walked their engineers out of the data centre. And I walked in the year after that trying to sell them more gear. So you can imagine the reception, right? So that's what I started out doing. And look, a lot of what IBM taught me, I carry through today. It's
Rogers.
Really,
the IBM way. Remember the book?
Yeah, it's the IBM way, and it was also just a really good, disciplined way of going about doing business. And I think that that's the success for so many businesses we look at now. It's not the it's 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration, right? And
well, how did you transfer from big American corporate to New Zealand finance?
Yeah, well, look, we were posted overseas actually with my then wife's job. She was a diplomat, and then we came back, and I sort of had nothing to do. I sort of tried retiring in my sort of early to mid 40s. I'd had a very lucky career overseas, and I came back, and I actually landed a job in a finance company, the old Hanover Group. I was there for 9 months, and that was an amazingly short and tumultuous ride there, and I got out at the point at which I knew I couldn't add any value or do anything.
Did you see the early signs of trouble in the finance industry?
The first wave of the GFC hit there, so you were clearly starting to see warning signs there, no question. But it's interesting, these things when you go through them. At the time, the thinking was, we'll work it out, right? And there had been no precedence for anything. No one had ever seen what was about to come, right? Yeah. The meltdown. So everyone thought it was pretty manageable. And I was hired to list Hanover, actually, to be the MD at the listing of it. And when that wasn't going to happen, I had no role there, so I left. I actually went into Tower Group straight after that there to run their asset management business, which was also their KiwiSaver business, and that got me into asset management proper, and I've been there now for almost a decade.
So your early experiences, you started to see the New Zealand market. Did you see already gaps there or lack of maturity, do you think?
Well, look, it's a very small market, so there's lack of maturity everywhere in the New Zealand market, just by virtue of the size. But also, it's a very, let's call it an old-fashioned market. It is, I think that we are, New Zealanders in financial markets very much a product of the English middle class heritage. Yeah. So we have a very traditional way of thinking about how you should raise capital, how you should run a business. And I think, although I think this is changing, we have this inherited fear of risk. So we're not a particularly risk-taking culture, even though we have clearly exceptional examples of that all the time. But the general ethos is not one of risk-taking. It's one of the big messages we have for the companies we invest in, which is take more risk.
Well, you can see the baying of the wolves. Somebody goes broke and everyone wants retribution. When they risk money in a business, that not everything works out.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've worked in the US, for example, or in China, and setting up a business and failing is just a rite of passage. You're not taken seriously unless you're on your third business or something.
And the people who invest them realise that there is a certain amount of risk.
Absolutely. In fact, people don't invest in people who've only got one startup. They tend to invest in people who've been through some failures, because you get a lot of inherited wisdom when you get through that. So I think that there's a little bit of a knocking machine that goes on here, and a fear of being subject to that knocking machine. But I think also part of it has been the availability of capital. We've been a very capital-starved country our entire history. We've got this, we romanticise this number 8 why mentality. It also reflects, a lot of how business operates, which is, as soon as you get money, give it away or pay dividends or whatever. Don't double up. And whereas in other cultures, particularly the US, they'll double up.
Look at Warren Buffett.
Exactly. Or most US companies. I mean, if you look at the dividend yield on the US stock market, it's a fraction of the New Zealand dividend yield. So now that is going to change. It's already, KiwiSaver is already starting to change that, but it's going to make quite a dramatic change. So, and that will be reflected in the way people do business, because when you go from a capital-starved to capital-rich economy, you just get a whole lot more opportunities, and the glory will belong to those people who are fundamentally embracing of that opportunity and really put their energies into growth and into taking risks.
Yeah, but if you look at our stock exchange, which is very, very, very small, it appears to me that if you add up the numbers, the majority of them are either monopolies or utilities. Now, where is the opportunity for rapid growth?
Yeah, look, I think the stock exchange is rapidly becoming unrepresentative of New Zealand, and certainly of the future of the wealth generation in New Zealand. I think you're right. A lot of them are in pretty, let's call them closed or high barrier to entry industries. And the stock exchange is not doing a particularly good job of encouraging new companies to join.
Do you think the recent criticism was justified?
Look, I think the stock exchange is an institution which is slowly failing New Zealand. And the reason is, look, they've got some headwinds internationally. There's no question, stock exchanges, but ours seem to have been an exceptionally poor performer by almost every standard. And the reason, I think, is that if you think about the energy that goes into the activities of the stock exchange, let me draw you an analogy. Stock exchange is supposed to operate a marketplace, right, where everybody comes and everyone wants to come and exchange goods and services. What our exchange has done is they set up the marketplace, all right. In fact, they've inherited that. They have effectively a monopoly of the marketplace for certain sorts of capital. But they've also set up a big fancy stall in the marketplace and have decided to compete against everybody, right? Which is in the form of their funds management business. So, and obviously they're a competitor to us, and obviously I don't want to be competing against a stock exchange-owned entity, but it is a fact that one of the problems is that, you know, the success of any organisation is where does the energy go? Where is the focus? The focus and energy of the stock exchange is not in running the marketplace. It is in being the most successful stallholder in the marketplace.
Isn't there also a problem that aren't very many retail investors?
Well,
apart from the people who invest through the accumulators.
And I think all of those are second, and third, and fourth derivation events, right, of doing that, right? If you don't have a marketplace that people trust, if the run of the marketplace is saying not come to our market and see what you can buy and sell, it's come to the market and come to our stall, please. You just don't. So it doesn't work. And
do you think that's in part driven this frenzy for buying property in contrast?
Well, you've had a huge tax advantage, of course, in property as well. And, of course, that's been there for decades. So that is bound to change behaviours. And also, I think that, look, the property market is always a proxy for an economy, right? You know, you do GDP plus, and it's always where a lot of the money ends up anyway, right? A lot of listed companies in New Zealand own properties. They're basically property plays. Nothing wrong with that per se. But the interesting thing is, for the first time in my working life, I can see, though, in New Zealand, the shape of the capital market's changing dramatically now because, and it's a sheer supply issue, it's KiwiSaver. Because if you think about it this way, every dollar that's invested in KiwiSaver doesn't pay off a mortgage, right? People previously would have received that money in cash, would have got higher residential mortgages and paid them off. So all this money which is going into KiwiSaver is going into the real economy and out of the property market. And it's starting to add up. It's now 15 million a day is what KiwiSaver managers are sticking into the New Zealand capital markets.
KiwiSaver sort of rolls off the tongue. Can you help explain to our viewers what KiwiSaver actually is and how does it differ from other superannuation arrangements?
Sure. Well, look, KiwiSaver, it's the most successful savings scheme I think we've had in New Zealand now, right? So it's probably the most trusted brand name after term deposits and banks. It's got 2.7 million New Zealanders now who are contributing between nothing. Some of them aren't contributing, they've got open accounts, but a lot of them are contributing at least 3% of their salary and their employers putting in another 3%. And in a couple of months' time, the law will change so that they can contribute up to 10% of their salary.
And this money has to go into certain types of investments?
Yeah, so it goes to a manager and then you choose the fund. And typically people have a choice between growth, balanced and conservative type funds.
As any normal superannuation fund would be.
And they tend to be very diversified and professionally managed. There are two strokes of genius about KiwiSaver, three things that make it massively successful. First of all is the government subsidises it, right? Yeah. It gave a $1,000 kickstart to the first couple of million people who signed up. And now, even now, if you put in $1,042 in during the year, the government will give you $521.
Everyone.
Free money. Well, everyone over 18 and under 65. Free money. It's the only free money I've ever seen. So that's one reason why it's been successful. The second one is that it's incredibly efficient. The IRD does all of the heavy lifting and the movement of the money, which means it's actually relatively low cost to get into. The third thing is that, and this is really, really important, is that they all have independent custodians, which means that the manager who's looking after your money never touches your money. So, for example, in our case, it all goes to the public trust, which is owned by the government. So they look after your money.
So
they
sticky fingers can't get their mitts on the money. Well, that's quite
important. Never touch a cent, and no one can in KiwiSaver. So it is a very, very safe place to have your money. It doesn't mean to say the values won't go up and down as the markets go up and down, but the opportunity for fraud and malfeasance is almost zero.
I think it's noteworthy that we should look at some of the numbers. I can remember when I was at university, New Zealand had the lowest propensity to save in the world. Yeah. I mean, like it was almost less than 1%. Where are we now in terms of our propensity to save?
Total savings in KiwiSaver is now 54 billion, 10 years in. But that's like a hockey stick.
Yes.
So Treasury tell us that by 2030 we should have about 200 billion saved.
Wow, that's
Now, let me put this into perspective. Let's assume half of that gets saved in New Zealand, which is about the global norm. That means that $100 billion will be in our economy in 10 years' time, where it was zero, 20 years ago. Now, think about that in terms of the lift. I talked about that rising tide, right? That's about 2.3% of GDP. Never in our history have we seen this much money arrive, and never have we seen it arrive so consistently and reliably, which is why we are now branching off into private equity and venture capital, because we know that the money will be arriving and we can
rely on investing.
Yeah.
If you put the KiwiSaver money, which we've now identified as sort of a decent, reliable cash flow stream, we've also got Maori business who've become with a very similar mentality.
Totally.
And now I've heard it was at 58 billion or something enterprise, and presumably going to grow, with a very similar sort of intergenerational long-term view. That would have to give you some, positive feelings about the New Zealand economy in the future.
Oh, I'm way more bullish, long-term bullish. Look, things will go up and down. Donald Trump can sneeze and we might all catch a cold for a little while. But New Zealand is in probably relatively the most attractive place it's been in 100 years. Now, the interesting thing about that is, if you think about the capital history of New Zealand, if you think about economically, how have we evolved? One of the massive themes is tidal waves of capital. It was the English in the 19th century, then it was the Americans in the 50s, and it was the Japanese in the 80s, and now it's the Chinese, right? Big tidal waves of capital. They come in and buy everything, and there's all this argy-bargy about foreign investment. The problem with tidal waves is it's one hell of a ride when it's coming in, but it leaves a lot of destruction when it leaves, right? So, but we have never had what I would call a rising tide of capital, and that's what KiwiSaver is. $15 million, and it grows every single day. It's a little bit more.
But there's foreign super funds that are also wanting to buy in New Zealand.
Of course they are, absolutely.
The Canadians
as well.
are here in big time.
But they will come and go.
Okay.
But most importantly is this money stays. And if you think about $1 of domestic capital invested, the economists will tell you that it has about 2 times the GDP multiplier. So it increases GDP by about 2 times. And here's the really interesting thing, Kim. Look at Australia. I mean, just across the ditch is the best example of all. Australia's been recession-proof for 27 years.
Because of the capitalisation.
Exactly, and it's not because they got all the iron ore on the ground. They would have been a boom-bust economy like every other economy. It's this recycling of domestic capital which builds the roads, the sewers, the grids, which business needs in order to thrive.
Are we going to see KiwiSaver money ending up in this terrible infrastructure deficit that we have?
Yeah, well, I hope so. I've been making a public call saying this Infrastructure Commission bill is, I think, the most significant piece of legislation in the financial area that this government will bring in, because here's what's going to happen. I think we have, our Singapore moment is here, right? We have the opportunity. But we could be more like Nauru or Norway. Choose, because if you want to be like Norway, you're going to have to get government and the supplier of the capital together, agreeing on a long-term plan, large projects, securities that people can invest in with confidence, right? Or, because if that doesn't happen, KiwiSaver managers like us are just going to invest offshore. Let me give you an example. Right now, I can invest in 6 toll roads in Australia and none in New Zealand.
And it's almost like a convertible note. It's a fixed interest.
Well, there's all sorts of securities.
Okay.
We could be pure equity players, we could provide debt, we could provide convertible notes, all of these things. And here's why we want to do it, right? Think about, and this is why KiwiSaver is so different, and this really is the beginning of an economic renaissance in New Zealand. Because think about the nature of KiwiSaver money. Previously, everyone used to invest for 2, 3, 4, 5 years at most, right? This money's for 30, 40, 50 years. Every single day we get more money coming in. Net cash flow positive.
And you've got to put it somewhere, don't you?
And we know know it's going to be like that for the next 30 years, right? Assuming we don't stuff up our business model. So the money keeps on coming in. It's what we call long duration. It needs, the investments we want to make with 30-year money are 30-year investments. We want to be able to return nice, reliable, sturdy, inflation-proofed investments. Where can you get those right now? The only asset class which is long duration in New Zealand is property, right? So an unnatural amount of it goes into commercial property, and in the hands of ordinary New Zealanders, residential property. We absolutely want to own sewers, wastewater, fresh water, electricity grids, all this really boring stuff, because all of those infrastructure assets, they return about GDP plus a little bit. They tend to be inflation proofed. they're highly reliable, and here's the really interesting thing, Kim, this is very different. They're highly politicised. And what I mean by that is that we have a competitive advantage as the suppliers of money on behalf of KiwiSaver members in buying any asset in New Zealand. You can sell anything to New Zealanders, right? It's the selling it to the offshore people that's so sensitive, right? So KiwiSaver is all New Zealand money. And if something goes wrong, let's say we did a deal with the local and central government, if something goes wrong in 20 years' time, I, as the asset manager, who have a fiduciary responsibility to my KiwiSaver members to look after their money, I can go to the minister responsible and say, Minister, I guess you can stuff us on this deal if you want to, but we've got a couple of 100,000 voters.
Yeah.
You know?
So they're going to care what happens.
Exactly, they're really going to care. So we have the added layer, you know, we have it's a long duration asset, it's a reliable asset, it's in our own home turf, so we understand the rules, we understand the politics, and also we have the biggest player in town, government, effectively on our side.
Well, of course, the capital's got to find a home. We've got lots of places for it to
Yep.
go. I know we've got Mr. Jones with his regional investment fund. I mean, all of these things are going to give liquidity to the economy. Can I go back a little bit to talk about how investment funds are managed in New Zealand? Whenever I read retirement columns and so on, there's this bugbear of fees and the efficiency of the investments.
Sure.
And it just seems to me odd that with such a tiny stock exchange, there should be such a high percentage going in fees.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
Totally, it's a complete gravy train, and that's why we set up Simplicity.
For
We set up Simplicity as a non-profit and as the lowest fee provider, and we'll just keep on lowering our fees as we get scale. And the reason we did that is this. Fees are a massive drag on returns. Let me give you an example of how our industry talks, but what the truth really is. Our industry will tell you, listen, we only charge you 1%. That's very reasonable. 1% doesn't sound very much, does it, Kim?
No.
But imagine if your rates were 1%. Imagine if you had $1 million home in Auckland and your rates were 1%. That'd be $10,000. Now, you'd be rioting in the streets at a 1% fee. And here's another way of looking at it. Let's assume that the average KiwiSaver fund will grow at about 5% per annum.
No matter what they do.
Yeah, over the cycle, a conservative KiwiSaver about 5%. But if you're taking 1% in fees, that means for every $5 that you make, $1 is getting taken away.
That's 20%.
That's 20%. That's a tax. That's not a fee. That's a tax on your returns. And if you add that up now, the actuaries who work for the government have said that the average lifetime fee in KiwiSaver will be something in the region of $54,000 a year. Sorry, $54,000 over your lifetime.
Yeah.
Well, that's more than you'll pay for power, which is about $36,000, and your phone about $35,000. So it's a huge drag. Now, that is massively lucrative for our industry. The KiwiSaver industry this year will take just over $500 million worth of fees. The amount of capital that they require to put aside to be a fund manager is zero. Zero capital, $500 million worth of fees, and that's cash. And that doesn't matter how much your fund goes up or down. Well, supposedly managing your money, but look, it is hugely lucrative. That is why when you've been into your bank branch, you've probably been asked about KiwiSaver, right? It is hugely lucrative. So, and that has been our industry. And look, when funds were growing at 10, 20%, when there was inflation, when all of those things were happening, those things could be buried and they didn't seem so much now.
So if simply by taking the fees out, even if Simplicity isn't smarter than any of the others, over the long term should outperform any other.
Well, those same actuaries have said that our low fee should make the average member about $65,000 wealthy when they retire. Now, that's a 20% increase in your retirement. It's like a 20% pay rise when you retire. Now, the reason we did it that way was because we started out with a blank sheet of paper. I said, look, I didn't need or want to make any more money in life. How do we do the biggest possible give back? And the biggest possible give back we worked out was to run a low fee. Look, bring the pack and save warehouse mentality into the finance industry, which is what we're doing.
Tell me how it's working.
Well, great. I mean, we're the fastest growing in the country now, and look, we've been operating for 2 years now, and we have about 24,000 members, about 800 million of funds, and it's growing. It's growing faster and faster.
So, how does an individual who takes on the idea that the fees are anything, not just annoying but expensive, how can they get into Simplicity as opposed to the BNZ or anyone else?
Well, the first thing we did, we spent 2 years setting up the business, and in those 2 years, a lot of it were cups of coffee with government regulators to allow you switch online, because previously to switch KiwiSaver you had to go into your bank branch,
a lot of messing around,
insurance, a lot of paper. So now our average member switch time is 1 minute 44 seconds. So that's how long it takes to switch now, yeah. And then we do all the rest. And the whole industry is rapidly moving towards online switching now. So it's that's, I talked about the IRD doing all the heavy lifting. The IRD does the heavy lifting there. So it's incredibly easy. Most people don't know that. Most people aren't aware of it yet.
No, they would think, they want some. Well, it's all in the past been very complicated. So
yeah, and our industry wants you to think it's complicated. And the bank, look at those bank billboards you see. Why are they full of cheesy families with smiley faces and not giving you the facts? It's because the industry doesn't want you to understand money. It wants you to think that money is difficult and complex so that you won't ask questions. Because once you start asking questions, they're difficult. They're hard to answer. Like, why are you charging me so many fees? Why does it take so long to... And it's questions like, why do I pay a penalty to repay my mortgage early?
Yeah.
Because you're just on lending the money.
So
if I repay it,
yeah.
you're just going to make money from somebody else.
So
why are you charging me a fee to do that? Those are very difficult questions, which is why they don't get addressed by the industry. One of the interesting things, Kim, I've discovered about money in my 40 years of doing it, money's really simple. Money's incredibly simple. It's just that our industry doesn't want you to believe it's simple. You have to make 5 or 6 decisions in your life and you'll be just sweet with money. But that is not a profitable endeavour for our industry, so they want you to think that money's hard.
Anyone watching this concerned about the retirement, we're thinking, well, I wonder how efficient my investments are. The Simplicity story is a compelling one. How can they get a hold of you or find out more about it?
Super easy. Simplicity.kiwi. Just go on the web. It's all there. Everything's on it. We don't have any paper. We only do stuff online. And look, and of those fees you'll pay us, we'll give 15% to charity, which is what we do. We invest with a conscience. There's a whole lot of sectors we won't invest in because they're bad investment ideas. They're underperforming industries now. The modern young consumer is actually way smarter at working out where their money should go. Give you a very good one for you and I, right? 30% of 18 to 25-year-olds don't drink. Alcohol's actually a bad investment now.
No kidding.
Yeah, now when we were that age,
booze
alcohol
and gambling
they were great investments, right?
Yeah.
Now they're underperforming. And there's a whole lot of underperforming industries that we've actually cut out, which are actually, people don't want their money invested and they're really not performing because as consumers they're walking away from those industries. It's a fascinating story.
And if somebody goes to Simplicity, can they actually choose some of the industries do you have special funds like green funds?
Yeah, and so we just eliminate all of that from all of our funds. We have we're 100% ethically invested in that regard because they're bad investments and because none of our members want their money invested in this stuff. And it's super easy, less than 2 minutes to switch and lots do it every day.
Well, I think Sam, we've started at the beginning. What I hear is a compelling story. A sense of optimism, I think, for New Zealand.
Huge.
And of course, this cash coming in is music to my ears, given the lack of liquidity we have across the whole economy. And of course, given the massive infrastructure investment that we needed here, it couldn't have come at a better time. And I don't think Simplicity could have come at a better time either. So Sam Stubbs, thanks for being on Business at the Speed of Coffee.
Thank you. Cheers.